Hello. Funnily enough, the value that I chose was courage, which I guess is not that surprising, knowing what was about to come next. And you know what, it is tough to go last because I'm following on some really fabulous speakers, and half of them have nicked my material. So there's a bit of adjustment going on mentally as we go through. And I was thinking about this one, and it is nerve-wracking standing up here, isn't it? But I thought, well, whatever happens in the next 15 minutes, it's not going to be as tough as Wednesday's gig when I was standing in front of 190 16-year-olds and there was a massive punch-up halfway through. As Julia says, I work with parents, I work with teachers, and I work with teenagers. And I love working with teenagers because if it's nothing else, it's never boring. And I work in therapy with individuals, with couples, and with families. And above all else, what I have observed is that the quality of our lives is largely determined, I think, by the quality of our relationships. Think about it. Nobody ever had on their grave, "She kept a tidy house," or "He was an incredible fisherman." It says things like, there are some pretty weird ones out there, as you can see. Here are a few that I found Googling around. There are some pretty weird ones. But actually, most things say things like beloved wife and mother, darling son or daughter, loved forever until we meet again. And the amazing moments in our lives, I think, are generally better shared, and the horrendous times, some of which we've heard about this morning, are definitely made more bearable when we can share them with others and they're by our sides. Our personal relationships really, really matter to us. But whenever, wherever, and for however long you are in communication with another human being, you are in a relationship with them. And perhaps the most important and certainly the longest relationship we ever have with anybody is the relationship that we have with ourselves. And the reason I say it's probably the most important relationship is because it's the one that will affect how we feel, it's the one that will affect how we behave, and indeed, it's the one that will affect whether or not we can build strong relationships with other people. Now, if you're unsure about what I'm banging on about, your relationship with yourself, think about how you talk to yourself. Does that little voice in your head chatter away, saying things like, "Oh, God, you're such an idiot. Why did you say that? That was so embarrassing. I went too fast. I went too slow. You're never going to succeed at this"? Or is it a kind of kinder, more benign soul that says things like, "You know what? You're all right. You're kind. You're gorgeous. People really like you. You can do this"? What we're talking about here, that little voice in your head, and we all have one, is your internal dialogue. And however it sounds, it will have a profound effect on how you feel. And when we feel okay, we act okay. When we are kind and we accept ourselves, we don't feel threatened by other people. We don't need to erect barriers and walls to stop others seeing the parts of ourselves that we don't really like. We can be open, we can allow intimacy. In other words, we can build good relationships. I was going to use the line about the safety instructions on an aeroplane, but that one's already gone, so we'll move on. So, if our relationship with ourselves is influenced by our internal dialogue, how does that develop? Where does that little chattering voice come from? It starts really, really early. When we're born, we are 100% reliant on our parents for our survival. We really, really need them to look after us. And so we work incredibly hard to ensure that they don't forget about us. We are absolutely hardwired to seek their attention. And whilst we go for the positive attention, anything, frankly, is better than nothing. Anything is better than nothing. So perhaps next time when you come across a child who is constantly doing the wrong thing, you might be a bit kinder if you realise that the chances are that's how they've learnt to get the attention they need to make sure that they survived. Actually, when you think about that, it's really sad. As we grow, we find ourselves in other environments where the attention of adults can affect the quality of our lives. We have schools, we have clubs, we have hobbies, and then later on we have peers, we have our partners, we have our lecturers, and we have our bosses. These people all rank amongst the significant adults in our lives. And as we're parents, we invest very heavily in keeping their attention because at the end of the day, we know that they have power when it comes to our general happiness and our well-being. Our heavy investment in keeping these significant adults on board means that we adapt our behaviour to suit the environment that they create for us. And the messages that they give us, we very often swallow whole. So when I was just mere, 14, and asked to choose my O-levels, which shows you how old I am, asked to choose my O-level options, I was considering art until a report came through from Miss Dittmar. And in the report she wrote, "On the basis that Alicia simply cannot draw a straight line, I do not think that art O-level is going to be for her," which I was like, "Ooh, I am not creative." I then spent the next decade avoiding all things creative until one day I find myself working, not dissimilar to you, as an event organiser, party planner, and I was standing on the top deck of a cruise ship creating Narnia. And I thought, you know what, Miss Dittmar, I still can't draw a bloody straight line, but I bloody well am creative. Now, I'm kind of guessing that as sort of young, trendy, creative urbanites, you probably won't be regular listeners to Radio 4's The Archers, which, by the way, is a huge, huge mistake. Anyway, it recently ran a story about Helen, who's a feisty lady, has her own cheese business, and a woman of the world. And she married a guy called Rob, who seemed to be the oh-so-perfect partner, only to discover that he was deeply emotionally abusive. Gradually, he stopped her seeing her family and friends. He criticised her every move. He stopped her driving. He told her what she could wear, what she couldn't wear, where she could go, where she couldn't go. And Helen adapted and adapted and adapted to try and keep him happy, as us Archer addicts screamed at the radio and wrote letters to the production team offering my counselling services. And then the day came when she could take it no longer, and he threatened her son, at which point she snapped and stabbed him with a kitchen knife. I can tell you, it was the 4th of April, it was my birthday, and it was the best present I got all day. And as my lovely husband would say, and so speaks the counsellor. But anyway, seriously, the storyline was actually very, very well researched. They spent a lot of time with refuge centres working with abused people, and it very accurately reflected the extreme levels of adaptation that people make as they try to keep abusive partners happy. And whilst I could never describe Miss Dittmar as abusive, actually it was deeply unhelpful to be given the label of the uncreative one. If you think about it, we label people all the time. We do it collectively, we do it individually, and I'm kind of willing to bet that you can all think of some labels that you have either overtly or covertly attached to your friends, your partners, your children, and your colleagues. Now, some labels seem positive: kind, determined, sporty, good-looking, and others are very obviously definitely not quite so positive. But either way, we need to remember that these labels are extremely sticky, and we live up to them, and many of them ultimately come to define us. So, for example, if your label is to be the kind one, does that mean that you never say no when people ask you to do things for them? If your label is to be the determined one, does that mean that you keep going long past the time when actually it's in your health's best interest to stop? If your entire sense of yourself is to be the sporty one, what happens when you injure yourself and have to retire? You only have to think of all the rugby, cricket players, the golfers and jockeys who suffer mental illness when they have to stop doing the thing that they think defines them. And you know what? If you're the good-looking one, I hate to tell you, but at some point it's all going to head south. As children, we simply don't question our labels. And actually, perhaps many adults don't either, although what we've been talking about today is very much about raising awareness. But our labels have a really profound effect on our internal dialogue. And they lead to lots and lots of limiting beliefs. And those limiting beliefs set our mindset. Living up to our label becomes an end goal focus. It's like kind of creating a film script for our lives that we either consciously or unconsciously play out. For example, if our label is not good enough, we develop the belief that we are somehow inferior or defective, and that one day we're going to be exposed as such. We become overly sensitive to feedback because feedback feels like criticism. But feedback is the breakfast of champions. It's so important. Feedback gives us information. It gives us information on how we can move ourselves forward. It gives us information on what we could do to improve our relationships. Without it, we only have our very limited perspective to inform us. If we fear being exposed as not good enough, we start to avoid challenges. We avoid challenges, especially challenges that we think we might not be able to overcome. We start to compare ourselves with other people, and we feel threatened by their success. Comparing ourselves with others is a no-win situation. That's why, things like the social media is so pernicious, because we spend so long comparing, their perfected life that they've put up online with actually what we're feeling sitting looking at it. Some days you might have a few more likes or clicks than other people, and then you feel a bit better, but actually then you're under pressure to stay ahead. So, and other days you feel worse. Well, that's a no-win situation anyway. Comparing ourselves to others never made us feel good. We avoid competitive situations because we fear losing. And actually, through all of these unconscious actions, we fail to reach our potential. And surprise, surprise, our label of not good enough becomes that self-fulfilling prophecy. Developing awareness about our labels and thereby our script is actually really challenging work, but in my opinion it's so worthwhile, because discovering our unconscious drivers allows us to make conscious changes. In other words, with awareness comes choice. And whilst we're talking about awareness, we really, really need to pay attention to the labels that we attach to all the people we love, live, work and play with. Firstly, because as we've explored, they're sticky little suckers, those labels, and they impart messages that other people might end up living their lives by. But secondly, if we think about someone in a certain way, for example, if you think about somebody as difficult, moody, annoying, selfish, stupid, our brains have a way of filtering out any evidence that doesn't support our thinking. It's the law of attraction. There's a book on it. It's called The Secret. It's quite a good book, but it does say the same thing in rather a lot of different ways. So, and it really just says this. It really just says, what you pay attention to eventually manifests itself in our lives. So, for example, if you want to make money this year, then don't focus on not losing the little bit you've already got. If you want to post a letter, you suddenly notice the number of letterboxes there are on a journey that you've done 100 times. If you think someone is annoying, don't be surprised if it isn't long before the mere sight of them irritates the hell out of you. You start to avoid them whenever possible, and when you do see them, you're waiting for them to be irritating, and funny enough, it's not, they do. And so you kind of go round and round the same hamster wheel. So how we think about others will affect how we feel about them, which will affect how we treat them. I talked a little bit about CBT earlier, cognitive behavioural therapy. What we think affects how we feel, which affects what we do. If you change any one of these three, then the other two pretty much automatically change because they're all connected. And weirdly, the hardest one to change is usually our feelings. So if you're struggling in a relationship with somebody, try changing your thinking. For example, when it's your other half that's really irritating you, try and remember what it was that you fell in love with them for in the first place. Try and remember the good conversation and interactions you've had rather than focusing on the bad ones. And if that doesn't change, if that doesn't work, try changing what you do. So instead of avoiding the person that's annoying you, try spending more time with them. Because you never know, you might just discover that they are a lot more like you than you had realised, for the simple reason that it is often the things we don't like in other people that we don't like about ourselves. That's the things that we don't like about ourselves is often what we notice more in other people. There's a bit of food for thought. You can change your thinking, you can change your behaviour, you can thereby change your feelings. But the one thing we cannot change is other people. We can change ourselves, and sometimes we need to, because if you carry on doing what you've always done, you're going to carry on getting what you've always got. But you can't change other people. What you can do is create an environment that allows them to change. If a relationship in your life isn't working, don't expect that waiting for them to change is going to be the answer to your problems. It simply isn't. We can't change them, but we can provide an environment that allows them to change. So, for example, if you are constantly pointing out all the things your partner is doing wrong in your eyes, don't be surprised if they become defensive and angry. If you then point out that they're being defensive and angry, you probably won't find that it makes them any less so. In fact, if I were you, I'd beat a fairly hasty retreat. Have a look at this sentence. I kind of guessing that I might be right in thinking the first thing that most of you saw was the misspelling of whole. And if you had pointed that out to this obviously quite small person, if that was the first thing you pointed out to them, my guess is that you wouldn't have got to see the gorgeous smiley face that went behind it, because she would have deflated like a little balloon in front of you. I'm not sure if it's a cultural thing, but I think we seem to be very programmed to spot the negative. And I think it's a really, really bad habit. Because ultimately, what we focus on is what we get more of. So instead, it's about challenging ourselves to look for the good in other people. Thank you so much for asking me before you accepted that invitation. Oh my God, you remembered to put the bins out. Your presentation was so well constructed that actually, you know what, it made my job really, really easy. Thank you. When we notice the positives in others and say it out loud, actually we increase our chances of seeing those positives again and again and again. When we notice the positives in ourselves, we develop a more positive internal dialogue. And when we feel good about ourselves, we don't need to put other people down. We don't need to look for the negative. We can look for the positive. And the more we look, the more we are likely to find. So as we finish this amazing morning, my challenge to you, all of you, each and every one of you, is to go from here and at the very least, start to notice what you pay attention to on a daily basis. Because what you pay attention to is what you will feed, and what you feed is what will grow. So notice how you respond to the taxi driver, the waiter, your colleagues, your family. Are you focusing on the good and stroking it? Or are you focusing on the negative? Because whichever one you focus on is what you're going to see more and more and more of. And I like this particular quote. See the light in others and treat them as if that's all you see. Thank you.